As you all know, commodities have risen from obscurity to one of the priority on policymakers' agenda in recent years. Their growth in size and interconnection, both at the physical and paper markets, financial markets, magnifying the effects of potential dysfunctions in the pricing mechanism of commodities. The integrity, therefore, is key. Integrity of commodities benchmark is key, but pricing of commodities is not as simple as securities, financial securities. There are areas in which we have available liquid futures contracts or other types of contracts, very highly liquid, which can be used also for pricing of physical transaction. And we have areas in which the structure of the market does not allow for the expansion of liquid contracts, and therefore we are entering the area of indicators like benchmarks that are used as a mechanism of pricing in liquid markets. Those benchmarks themselves can be of different nature. So you may have benchmarks based on market data. You can have benchmarks based on executed transaction, arm's length transactions. You can have benchmarks that are purely based on voluntary submissions. So this may also in some cases require additional processing, so-called editorial processing, in which prices are to some extent put together and developed using this information. What regulation can do at this stage is to align the incentives in this process, because reputational mechanisms in some cases cannot be enough. And so the IOSCO started the discussion some years ago after the G20 on introducing some principles for price reporting agencies, and that has become the benchmark for other regulations on benchmarks, and in particular the one that the Commission proposed. Now I think it's a couple of years ago. I don't remember exactly the date. But IOSCO principles are indeed principles, and therefore need to be defined into details in order to be implemented at national level. So now the discussion is entering into the nitty-gritty of the proposals, and in particular on what kind of information is required to make these benchmarks transparent and avoid and minimize the risk that opaque price formation mechanisms can affect the stability of those markets, so the orderly functioning of the pricing of commodities. So there are at least three important areas of this. In the proposal, we have three key areas, I think, that are relevant for commodity benchmark. Certainly, governance and control over the benchmark, so the administrator, or let's say reporting agencies that are in charge of doing that. Of course, there is the discussion here whether a price reporting agency should be considered an administrator. There are some claim that they are simply journalists, but I think that the answer is a bit more complex than that. We have a code of conduct, which I think is very interesting discussion, because here I think the Commission faces the problem of making contributors liable to some extent of providing false information or misleading information that can distort market, but by doing directly via imposing sanctions that can have also extraterritorial effect, it might be more complex than that. So there's been the introduction of this code of conduct that to some extent would like to give an answer to that without imposing too much burdens on the contributors, and so shy them away from providing contributions to the reporting agency. And the third element certainly are the methodologies on input collection, processing, and so on. Here again, it's very important to do a balancing act, because, as I said, in some areas these the benchmarks rely on voluntary submissions, so you don't want to scare the markets off. But there is a level of rules that need to put into place in order to make sure that those principles that IOSCO and Alp knows very well has proposed some years ago, and that are certainly the basis of this discussion. Of course, the discussion is going even beyond that, so I'm just giving this high level, but there is a point, for instance, on the aspects of data sufficiency, which I think Martina will touch upon, and which I think it's a very important, because it defines the priority that the benchmark providers should actually take into account when collecting the information from the market, so arm's length transactions, so in a pecking order. The other element is the data disclosure, and we are seeing this also in other regulation. How much information around these benchmarks can we disclose? For instance, we have having this discussion, and I think it's an important part of the open access requirements in MiFID, is that how much information you need for trading and clearing. And here you touch upon a very complex area where you have a mix of intellectual property rights that may extend to information that should not be provided to third parties, or may enter into confidentiality agreements. And confidentiality agreements essentially may bind the reporting agency not to disclose the information about the submission. However, I believe that, and the most important one, to some extent, might also be the issue of the code of conduct. And in that area, certainly, there is a need to restore trust among the contributors themselves, because what is happening as well is that contributors do not trust each other, just because if you start to provide data to a reporting agency and are not sure that the process is done correctly, you might be to some extent liable in competition authorities' investigation about collusion, about types of market behaviors that are potentially linked to this type of instruments. So there is a need also to restore trust among the contributors of benchmarks. And to some extent, I guess, the proposal of the Commission trying to balance that, of course, needs some fine-tuning, but I think that the bulk of how to restore this trust is more or less there.